Good evening, and welcome to the Wednesday, March 25th, 2015 meeting of Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. First item on the agenda is approval of the minutes for March 11, 2015. Thank you, Debbie. Move to approve. Is there a second? I'll take Rob's second, just to change it up. Any corrections or Scribner's notes? At one point I found the preposition to missing, but I can't figure out where it is again. So with no other thoughts, call for a vote. All in favor of approving the minutes of March 11, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And abstentions. Okay, no abstentions, Ann. Correspondence.
Well, I wanted to give you an update on the 2014 Citizen Survey, which is being computed right now. And so there's three sections: regular city questions, then you have commission questions, and demographic information. And the first section's been drafted, and the second two will be completed this week. So from there, the entire document will undergo administrative review, and it's expected to be presented to council on the 6th of April. So we should have those results fairly soon.
Great. Thank you, Mike.
I also wanted to take a quick minute to report on Legacy Crossing market study, which was recently conducted with preliminary results. We had Johnson Economics of Portland, Oregon, which was selected to complete the assessment. And a final report's been received, and a workshop with, or the preliminary final report's been received, and a workshop with Johnson Economics will be held in April, and that will be to present the findings in the discussion. And so just wanted to highlight the findings real quickly. They were that use types within strongest market support include upscale apartments, small-scale retail and food service spaces, and medical office space. Study also indicates that pent-up market demand for upscale downtown living opportunities, upscale residential opportunities near campus could also increase marketability of the University of Idaho to students. The demographic composition of local population indicates steady increasing demand for medical services. Study also indicates market support for smaller scale commercial development, which includes smaller retail space and restaurants that complement downtown. And so the conclusions that were drawn are that three-story wood frame mixed-use projects with surface parking appear to be supportable in the local market, Legacy Crossing. Wood frame upscale urban residential and medical office projects also appear to be supportable in the market. And downtown retail and office demand is anticipated to limited in the short term. So like I mentioned, those are preliminary right now, but they'll be conducting a workshop with the Johnson Economics in April to finalize those.
Great. Thank you, Mike.
Where did you say the firm was from, the consulting firm?
Portland, Oregon.
Exactly. That's very good.
And I will share that the shared readings are now posted online, and they connect to the ideas in this market absorption study. Two different takes on the issue of mixed use. One is a spatial analysis about what mixed use might look like. I've thought of it as pancakes, commercial on the bottom, residential on top. This little article gives some other ways to think about that. And the other article talks about a project that wished to end up commercial, like Legacy Crossing, but couldn't start there in the market. And so the challenge was, how do you design it so that it can be residential now and adaptable to commercial later with their different spatial needs and things like that. So anyway, two interesting shared readings that we'll look at perhaps in 2 weeks. We'll have to see what the agenda looks like. If it gets crowded, we'll move them down.
Quick comment there that the initial residential development instead of commercial sort of reminds me of West A Street, which we had initially thought was going to be commercial and is now almost totally developed as residential.
And given the way West A Street got built out, it would be very difficult to convert it short of demolition. So this project was trying to figure out how to not get in that bind.
Yeah.
Great. And so for the interest of the audience and the public, Shared Readings is a web resource that we created for ourselves, and you can find it linked from the Planning and Zoning Commission page down towards the bottom right. There's a link to Shared Readings, and you will see a listing of links, which are the readings we read over time. And these should be the top two. Great. Thank you, staff, for getting that pulled together. Joel, Transportation Commission meeting report.
The Transportation Commission last met 2 weeks ago, March 12th, Thursday. There were two main topics of discussion at the meeting. The first was a discussion of some possible changes to the thinking about the northeast quadrant of the proposed ring road that we have in the long-range planning documents for the city. The staff was outlining some possibilities of a realignment of the northeast quadrant, basically between the Troy Road and 95 North, following more nearly existing roads. The way the ring road was initially laid out by the Transportation Commission many years ago, basically the location was pretty much dictated by topography and so on, and it appears that it would be possible, consistent with topography, to follow more nearly along existing roads, and that might perhaps make more sense. The second major topic of discussion was the discussion of the 3rd Street possible bridge, 3rd Street corridor. That was one of the priorities in the transportation, intermodal transportation report. The Commission will be looking at the 3rd Street corridor. The recommendation from the intermodal transportation report was a multimodal bridge, including automobiles and bicycles and pedestrians. I think the Transportation Commission will take perhaps a somewhat broader view of that, looking at all possibilities, but we've also been told that the Council seems to be perhaps leaning in the direction of the recommendation as made in the plan for a multimodal bridge. So the Commission certainly will be spending a significant amount of time in some future meetings looking at what the a multimodal bridge and associated traffic calming might look like in the 3rd Street corridor. The next meeting of the Transportation Commission will be in 2 weeks, the second Tuesday of the next month.
Okay, thank you. And do you expect some of these same items on the agenda, or not yet?
I have not seen an agenda yet. I suspect that 3rd Street corridor will be probably on the agenda.
Okay. Thank you, Joel. Next up, open microphone. This is a time that we reserve in our agenda where members of the public may speak to the Commission regarding matters that are not on the agenda nor currently pending before Planning and Zoning Commission. If you wish to do this, please state your name, come to the microphone, state your name and address for the record, and limit your remarks to 3 minutes. Any takers? All right. Next up, we have a report being presented by Nick Samuel and Spencer Plum from the Department of Conservation Social Sciences. Some of you may remember that they have started this work last fall as a class project. The title is Understanding the Community Perspective on the Effects of Climate Change in Moscow. Nick.
So far, so good. There we go. Okay. I'm Nick Samuel, Spencer Plum, and we got one of our students who helped us collect the data. He's going to get extra points on the final. Anytime you get a couple of academics and a captive audience and a PowerPoint, we're going to put you to sleep. We got about a good 20 minutes to talk about, so I'll leave out the usual jokes. We had a team of 10 students, and we turned them loose on a series of people. Nels was one of them. I think Nels might have been. I don't know if we talked to you, but we talked to a bunch of experts around town as a way to collect information on what should go into our survey. And they did this as a service learning project for the university. And our objectives were very simple. We wanted to collect defensible data on what the community thought about climate change, local climate change, their beliefs, behaviors, concerns, and more importantly, their preferences for local land use responses to climate change. We used standard survey techniques, the Dillman method. We administered 250 questionnaires to residents in Moscow, face-to-face, or really door-to-door. We did random sampling. We left off the dorms, Greek housing, campus housing, just because they are impossible to survey in a random format, and it skews our data. So we picked one random person from each randomly selected household, typically the person with the closest birthday to the survey day, which was in October, middle of October last fall. And our sample's accurate to about plus or minus 6%, which is pretty darn good for this kind of work. Quite a copy of our questionnaire. I wish I had copies left over to give you. If you really want it, we can send it to you electronically. We started off with a document that's been around for about 7, 8, 9 years, put out by Yale University, but it involves George Mason, Princeton, a few other Cornells involved, and they've been surveying people across the country now for 9 or 10 years, and have identified what they call 6 Americas. And we wanted to use their information or their instrument to see what the 6 Americans look like in Moscow, Idaho. So we got a hold of them, we got their instrument, we added questions of our own, and the national findings suggest that, going from left to right, we have 14% who are alarmed, and these are the folks, as it says here, highest belief in global warming, the most concerned, the most motivated. These are the folks who, when we talk about them in private, we say, these are the folks who say the sky is falling, it's coming down on you. Okay? On the other side is the dismissive group, 11% nationally. They're sort of the mirror image of the alarmed. Okay, nothing's going to happen. Sure, it's getting warmer, drier, colder, whatever, but nothing's happening. In the middle are people who have sort of a varying degree of belief in climate change. The biggest group is the concerned group. Next is cautious. And then you move into disengaged. People who sort of remove themselves for various reasons from the debate. And then the doubtful. These people on the left are the most knowledgeable, the most active. Knowledge typically declines as you go from left to right. And we certainly found that from Moscow. The key thing to remember here is the alarmed, the 14%, and the dismissive are the ones who are driving the national and I suspect the local agenda. They're the folks with the most to lose or the most to gain. The folks in the middle are innocent bystanders, so to speak. So what we did was we used Yale's 15-question scale. It contains questions on climate change beliefs, their involvement in the issue, behaviors relevant to climate change, and what the social response is. And Joel, being an economist, will understand what latent class analysis is. Any questions can go to Joel, I think. But basically, it's what Yale has used to identify 6 Americans. We used it in our research. So here's how we stack up against the rest of the country. A few more people who are alarmed in Moscow, a lot more who are concerned, about the same number of cautious people, quite a few less disengaged, same amount of doubtful, and about half as many dismissive people. Collectively, the folks on the left 3, so the believers, if you will, make up about 82% of Moscow's population, and the folks who are less concerned with climate change make up 18%. The disengaged group is a small group, 3% in Moscow, but they're an interesting group. As we go through the analysis, these people sort of mimic the concerned group in many ways. 3%, so it's within our margin of error, so we don't get too excited about it. But these people are disengaged for reasons other than the debate on climate change. So let's look at sort of what these segments, we're going to look at 2 real key demographics. Residency in Moscow, we got bimodal, so the believers and the disbelievers sort of share the same sort of residency. The average is about 13 plus years living in Moscow. The disengaged have been here on average about 10 years. We looked at people 18 and older, so we did include some students, not necessarily the on-campus freshmen. So this includes the whole cross-section of Moscow. When we look at the income category, the high, let's go back this way, the higher income are less likely to be believers in climate change. The median or the mean income is someplace between 60 and 80,000 a year. So we didn't dwell on demographics. We have that data. If anybody's interested, we can get it to you. But let's look at their perceptions of climate change. This actually mirrors the national trend. The alarmed believe it's happening now. The concerned say it's going to happen in 10 years. Somewhere between 20 and 40 years is the next 2 groups. And then finally the dismissive will say 100 years to never. So it's immediate for them. It's way, way in the distant future for the other 18%. Is it a threat to their preferred way of life? Is sort of the opposite trend. The alarms say yes. So 4 is strongly believe that it is a threat, and then it decreases as we go towards the dismissive group, who don't see it as much of a threat. Concern about how climate change could affect Moscow. Same sort of trend. The alarmed are concerned, or tending towards very concerned, all the way down to dismissive, who are very unconcerned that it could affect Moscow. How disruptive will the change be? So they might not be concerned, and this represents the whole sample. The whole sample, in part because this rank ordering is similar across all 6 groups. The magnitudes are slightly lower for the dismissive group, but this is close enough to representing everybody. We left it as a single graph. Water quality, water supply, drought, there's some flooding that comes in there, but most of these are moderately disruptive or more so in people's mind. So they might not be concerned, but things are going to disrupt their behavior. Some of them react differently to this, and some of them are willing to accept these disruptions, as you'll see in a second. This sort of looks at the average of all those disruptions. We summed them all up, and in general, the more they believe in climate change, the more disruptive they see things as being, and as you get down to the dismissive group, they see it as only being somewhat disruptive collectively. So there's less difference here than we would have expected looking at some of the other indicators. Preferred responses by the city. Spencer's going to take over and walk through that. That's
all right. So transitioning sort of from thinking about how are people perceiving climate change and how it affects them to thinking about what can be done about climate change or what should be done. So thinking more about their preferences for what the role of the city could be, or even their role in climate change. So a lot of the findings, again, we use these Likert scales, so all of the graphs that we present have most of them have the 1 to 5 ranking. And so they're either, we presented these questions about what should be done by the city, and so they either can strongly agree to strongly disagree. So the first question was about support for a city study. And I think the important thing here is that more than half of the population that we went and talked to were in support of the city taking on some sort of study to look at how climate change is going to affect the community. And then to go along with that, the importance of city planning and using that information to plan ahead. Again, very strong support, based on these groups that are alarmed and concerned. The concerned group for Moscow represents some 40% of that population. The alarmed group, another 16 to 18%, somewhere in there. So pretty broad-based support for using information to find out more about what's going to happen, and then using that to do some planning. How should the city respond? So thinking a little bit more about the types of actions that the city can take. Broadly speaking, there's a lot of support for encouraging lifestyle changes, not necessarily using incentives, not necessarily mandating anything, but facilitating the process of allowing people to make choices that are either helping them adapt to climate change or mitigating climate change in some way. One of those things, one of those measures could be support for mixed use to reduce the need to drive. I think that in this there are other things embedded in that. So mixed use, as you guys were talking about, it has multiple benefits. One of those benefits that is also overlaps with climate change mitigation is reducing the need to drive. So those things dovetail nicely. And again, it may be that there are those multiple benefits. We see pretty strong support for it. They could, these people could sort of be responding to the prompt about mixed use or about driving, but in either case, supportive for the most part. Who's responsible to lead the local response? And the important thing here, I think, is that it is really there is a strong desire to have local initiatives, and people want to get behind the community in taking some sort of action, and they don't want the state necessarily or the federal government telling them what's best for them. They want to be involved in those decisions and have people that know this place be involved in taking on the responsibility for responding to climate change. This next set of questions is about so starting to think about, okay, maybe there are some actions we can take, but there are also going to be costs associated with those. So we asked these trade-off questions where we asked them, would you rather deal with likely consequences of climate change, or pay a little bit more in order to take on some of the adaptive measures or some of the mitigation measures for climate change? And what we find is, along the same lines of what we've seen so far, those that are concerned and alarmed have more interest in in paying a little bit more in order to adapt and in order to respond. Those that are more doubtful and dismissive of climate change, much less appetite to pay more for those types of things. So in this case, thinking about power supply, if we consider that most of our power is coming from either coal or hydro, then there might be more taxes on coal, or maybe there can be uncertainty about how much hydropower we're getting if we're seeing water shortages in local basins. So are we willing to pay a little bit more maybe to promote renewable energies? And this sort of gives you a sense of the appetite for that among the community. Increased respiratory diseases, or some sort of increase in perhaps taxes in order to take on mitigation actions for climate change. Same sort of story here. Increased flooding. I think in this one we maybe a little less interest in increasing taxes, and that may sort of reflect that the community hasn't really dealt with major flooding issues, or doesn't perceive that as a major effect of climate change in Moscow. And so in a lot of ways this is nice to see in that folks are actually thinking about the issue and how it relates to the place. If we were on the coast, you might see a much greater appetite to pay for dikes and levees and things that might help a community adapt to climate change in a really wet or coastal environment. Whereas here we're seeing people think through it and say, that might not be one of the challenges that's most imminent for us. And then thinking about preferred planning solutions. So here we asked people to indicate whether they would be willing to participate, or if they are participating in any of these initiatives. And so ways to mitigate climate change by supporting actions like facilitating carpooling, promoting bike paths. I think there's things about renewable energy. So some of the things that can be done locally to reduce our own emissions. And what we see is really pretty broad support for at least 4 of the 12 things that we put out in front of folks. That would be renewable heating, or renewables for heating, bike paths, promote clean energy, and public transit. So, from those we can kind of distill transportation and our energy consumption are going to be 2 of the directions that people support some initiative from local officials. Here we just aggregated those responses, and what we see are that most folks are supportive of anywhere from maybe 5 to 8 of those initiatives of the 12. So more than half are supportive of at least half of those previous initiatives that we proposed. And even here at the low end, there are some things that kind of everybody can agree on. And that digging into that a little bit and figuring out what the real low-hanging fruit is for the city to take on, that might be something of interest to follow up on from this. And then the addressing local issues. I think this really gets at what people are kind of most concerned with. Some of it's maybe climate change related. Some of it maybe overlaps into just what they see they want in the community. But if we think about these things in a climate change context, certainly water is going to be a major issue. So managing aquifers, people are already have that on their mind. If climate change is affecting precipitation patterns in the Northwest, that's definitely going to become an issue. Definitely a sentiment that keeping agriculture and keeping open spaces around Moscow those come out as really important, and certainly important for adaptation as well, for the city in keeping green space and keeping shade trees and ways to maintain livelihoods around the Moscow area, which kind of reflect this preference for preserving farmland. And then I'll turn it back over to Nick to talk a little bit more about the 6 types of Muscovites.
Okay. So we'll give you a quick snapshot of each of the 6. The alarm, 16% of Moscow. Climate change is happening now, humans cause it. And this is consistent with every study that's been done by the Yale group. They're knowledgeable, concerned, they're threatened. In Moscow, they have about an average income, average residency, home ownership, and age. So they sort of meet the mean across a lot of our demographic data. They have strong action for the support for the city action, and very strong support for mixed use. 30% would like to see new technology. We didn't get specifics, but we assume that means solar heating, panels, that kind of stuff. Almost 70% support lifestyle changes. Half prefer a local government response. 25% would involve the public. And most are willing to pay extra to avoid these negative consequences, floods, drought, and so on. The concern, this is our biggest group, 41%. It's happening now. It'll peak in 10 years. Humans cause it. They're knowledgeable. They're concerned and threatened. They're longer-term residents of Moscow, 15 plus years, 14 plus years. Strong support for action, for mixed use, lifestyle changes. Similar to the previous group, they want government and the public, and they're willing to pay for mitigation. The cautious group, change is coming, but it's going to take 20, 40 years to get here. Half of them believe that climate change is human-caused, half believe it's natural. Somewhat knowledgeable, and new data is going to sway them. These are the people who are probably the most hungry for information. They're partially threatened. They are midterm residents, meaning they're sort of in the middle of the pack. They below average income. There's support, but it's moderate for city action. Still some strong beliefs in mixed use, lifestyle changes, local government, the public, and 28% would like to see local businesses involved. This is the only group that actually picked businesses as a partner. And they're moderately willing to pay for extra cost to go with it. The disengaged group, 3%, it's small. It's within our margin of error. But they're somewhat knowledgeable. They have low concern. If climate change is coming, it's coming in 40 years. But they act like the concerned group. And we think that they're disengaged because of this next item. Oops. Big thumbs. They're oops, back one more. There we go. Shortest term resident of Moscow. So less than 10 years. They're the youngest by quite a bit, about 10 or 15 years. Lowest mean income, largest household size, not necessarily family, but household, and the lowest home ownership rate. So these are people who have other things on their mind, we think. Okay, and this is far less than we've seen in national surveys. There's still support for city action, support for mixed use, support for lifestyle, but there's a good third of them are unsure of what the response should be. Interestingly, 25% would involve federal and state agencies. So they're willing to reach out to anybody who can help. But they're still willing to pay for mitigation costs. The doubtful, 10% of the sample believe it's natural caused. They're not worried about it. It might happen. It might happen over the next 100 years. They're not necessarily knowledgeable. They're threatened somewhat, but they're not concerned about being of the threats. They're the longest term residents, above average income, highest home ownership. Low support for action by the city and for mixed use. They don't see a need for a city response. They don't believe that the city is even responsible to respond, and a third are unsure. If we compare them to the doubtful group or the dismissive group, they're somewhat similar. This group sees, there's 81% sees no need for a city response. And the dismissive would involve local nonprofits in the mitigation. And they're extremely willing to suffer the negative consequences. So they're willing to suffer through droughts and plagues and whatever else we throw at them. We have some other information about them. We left them off this presentation that deals with behaviors that they've adopted. And we found less sort of discrimination in behaviors. Even this group does things that we would consider pro-conservation behaviors, but they adopt them, probably for other reasons than conservation. So things like recycling, buying local, driving less, walking more. We looked at driving habits, commuting habits. Everybody drives about 70% of their trips are driving. Very few people use mass transit, yet they want it as a solution. So there's a little bit of noise in these profiles. And then we're going to end with Spencer telling you what the imperative for action is. 3 more slides.
All right, so summing up a lot of what we've already expressed, broad support and concern about climate change. If we add up the concern group to the folks that are really concerned, we get more than 80% of the people in Moscow thinking about climate change impacting their lives at some point. Also, that goes along with this idea of pretty broad support for taking action, and then but also a recognition that there are costs associated with that. Certainly, one way to approach that, and one way to sort of make those costs maybe more amenable, is to talk about multiple benefits across sectors. These can be things that we can do that both address climate change and make Moscow a more livable community, or make Moscow more attractive to students coming into the University of Idaho, or there are a lot of ways to sort of bundle these things together. And then a real emphasis on local initiatives. So making these things specific to Moscow and having a plan that is put together right here by the people that live here. And I think those are quite important to keep in mind for thinking about these ways to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. So some of the ways that mitigation can happen is increasing number of biking and walking paths. That's another one of those dovetailing items that would have broad support for multiple reasons. Increase availability of public transit. Promote non-polluting sources of energy for existing homes and businesses. Again, that could be something that, in the long term, that can drive down costs for homeowners, or costs for even residents in rentals. By having renewables on a facility, you can actually reduce the cost of those utilities if they're done right and done at a large enough scale. And then supplementing renewable energy sources for domestic heating and cooking. So again, that ties into this idea of renewables. Important issues to address over the next 10 to 20 years. Again, a lot of these really have climate change benefits, but also have other important things that the city might already be thinking about. So mixed use, pedestrian-friendly plans, smart growth, so keeping open spaces, planting more trees and for shade around the city, increasing small urban farms in Moscow. The local food initiative was one that we prodded a little bit, and maybe it's the Great Farmers Market that really drives that, but that's something that people are really supportive of. I think pretty much across the board, whether they believe in climate change or not. And then this idea of renewables, again, multiple benefits for that. And with that, we'll take any questions that you all might have.
Thank you so much, Nick and Spencer. Are there any questions that come to mind now?
Nels?
Some of the, in fact, quite a few of the recommendations are things that we would do if it was just a perfect world. And I just wondered how you really painted those. In other words, why would we want to walk? Well, we'd want to walk because we're getting fat, and there's a lot of things, reasons why we would like to, that have nothing in the world to do with climate change, mixed use, so that's where I was just trying to see if, as you've done this, how do you try and paint off the things that we would have done even if we weren't having a conversation about climate change?
All of these are taken verbatim from the questionnaire. And the ideas came from talking to people. We had Nils came to class and talked about some of the issues. In fact, one of the questions that's in the city survey, the community survey, it was also in our survey. So eventually we'll see if the two databases are identical. I hope they are. But we looked at the city plan. We looked at we looked at other documents, and these were some of the ideas that seemed to come out of the literature that said these are common solutions to local mitigation. They won't make the world cooler, but they'll make it more livable. And so some of these, we had about 14 of these issues. There was one issue that was universally panned, and that was go to alternate days of driving. Nobody liked that. I wouldn't like it. So we try to sort of make these realistic so they weren't far-fetched, but we try to make them so that they were things that could apply to Moscow. And all of this takes time, 10 to 20 years. And I know the city council now is looking at planting trees at the entrances to Moscow. Moscow's been a tree city, USA, for as long as I can remember. So we're doing some of these things already.
Sure. Well, that was my point is that I've been a little negative about, I think I'm shifting, but I've been a little negative about thinking about climate change right here in Moscow, but all the things that we've talked about that you've mentioned are things that we put in our comprehensive plan without having that on our mind. And what worried me in this knee-jerk sort of society that we're now living in, I kind of was thinking, I don't really want to put walking or mixed use in a thing that is colored by climate change. I just want to do what's an exciting way of life that's more productive for us. And so that was an issue that
I agree.
I've struggled with.
And I think one of the things that goes along with that is that you can target the people that are just interested in the lifestyle and having an active lifestyle, and by putting that in the plan, you appeal to them. But by also mentioning that these things could reduce the city's carbon footprint or make Moscow a bike-friendly city that has the lowest percentage of people making driving trips. Then you're building that support for those plans on this other side of the sort of the voting population that are thinking about climate change and thinking about ways that they personally can live in a way that has less impact on the climate. So I think it's in some ways a framing issue. You can frame it for the people that want to be active and be healthy, and you can frame it for folks that are thinking about this, which is a big portion of the Moscow population.
Great.
Yeah, I guess it's more of a comment, but I remember going to the American Collegiate Schools of Planning Conference, national conference, and 10 years ago when everybody was afraid to talk about climate change, but they realized it was happening and how to plan for it and sell the idea. And an example would be in urban areas, the urban heat island effect, because people, no matter who they were, could feel that physically. And they couldn't feel, climate change is a little harder to perceive except over a long period of time. And so they would experience the heat of going to, say, a large parking lot that had no shade coverage. And the interesting business end of that is that they found in places like California in the summer that people are more likely to shop in areas where they have tree coverage for their cars because their car doesn't get really hot. So sometimes there's that double, like you're saying, the double solution to kind of mitigate between the believers and the non-believers and move forward, instead of arguing and getting, we had this discussion 3 months ago on this commission about, what should we plan for climate change, and there's disagreement on this commission about whether we should or not for sure. But rather than sitting there at a standstill arguing about it, where can we agree, and where can we find solutions that everybody's comfortable with that also forward the goals of the comprehensive plan?
Yeah, a great example. I was down in Nevada last week and saw all this covered parking. I said, Nevada, it doesn't rain that much. Why do you need covered parking? They said, solar panels on top.
Right. So
and a couple of years ago, we had, none of my students here tonight. There's one more over there. A year ago, I think Nels saw the presentation where they wanted to cover the Kibito with solar panels. We thought it was a great idea. The experts hated it. So there's something wrong with that. I'm not sure. Well, why aren't all the buildings on campus solar paneled? I don't know.
Great.
Anyway.
Thank you again
really nice
so
study.
much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Joel.
Is this going to result in a written report?
We can get you more details. There is a report that the students put together, but it's not broken down by the 6 Muscovites. It's just the whole aggregate database.
Yeah.
But we can get you more details. Sure.
I'm interested in more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no economics in there, though, unfortunately. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. And a wonderful example of a really involved student learning opportunity.
Yeah, that's great.
All right, moving along, number 7, Mike, minor PUD amendment request for Tiempo Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. Tonight we have a minor PUD amendment request from Mr. Larry Leppelman for Tiempo Commons Plan Unit Development. And just to give you a little bit of background on Tiempo Commons, was first approved in January 10, 2007. And that's when the planning unit development as well as a final subdivision plat was approved by council for 54 detached single-family lots. You had many different models and a whole lot of different floor plans that went along with those models. Below is an example of the side elevation and a front elevation. This is just the typical house plan elevation that was submitted as part of the PUD request. Belly bands, a lot of them are pretty similar in variations in colors. Gable roofed. Some of them are hipped roofed as well. Models range from 1,142 square feet to 2,098 square feet in size, so you had quite a bit of a variation in the size of structure there. There was also sample elevations that were submitted along with the PUD process. And this was the plat that was submitted and ended up being approved. As you can see, those are all private drives. You have common pedestrian corridors. The houses are facing these pedestrian corridors, so they're all rear loaded here on the private drives. another pedestrian corridor here, and so every block is divided by a pedestrian corridor, so the streets don't actually have sidewalks except for the street here to the west as well as this street here to the north. On November 12, 2008, Planning and Zoning Commission did approve a minor PUD amendment request, and so this was the first minor request that was approved. And what that minor amendment did was adjust and consolidate the boundaries of 12 lots. And so these were in these two blocks here. And what that did was to create 8 lots of a slightly different configuration. And these are the Z lots. And so they're of an L-shaped floor plan for the buildings. And so what they refer to them as Z lots. And it was intended to more easily accommodate single-story homes. The majority of the homes that were approved through the PUD process were 2 stories in height. Just wanted to try to serve another sector of the housing market here, and so that was first approved in 2008. And then a second minor amendment request was approved in 2012, and that was to revert back. There's a couple of Z lots that were built, and then they had submitted the request to revert back to what was originally approved as part of the original PUD, and so it was to expand upon the 2 Z lots, and essentially you'd have 3 30-foot wide by 55 feet deep lots that it reverted back to when that minor amendment was approved. It also allowed the construction of twin homes. And so essentially what they had done was taken 2 of the typical floor plans and just joined those together to form a twin home, which is really a duplex that you have a common lot line going right down the party walls, and you sell them as single-family dwellings. And so that was approved, and that allowed the construction of twin homes within Tiempo Commons at that point. And so this is just the Z lots. So as you can see with those 2 blocks, we went from having 3 lots there to 2, and then they had the L-shaped configuration for the houses that were constructed on there. This is a street view of one of those single-story L-shaped lots, and there are a couple of them that are currently built. This was the twin home amendment, so really they had taken, like I mentioned, two floor plans, 2 houses, joined those together to have a common wall. And they took the 3 1/4 foot separation on the outside setbacks, created 7 feet on both sides to account for the 7 feet in between the units that they'd be losing to keep the massing and the scale of the development similar. So the proposal before you tonight is to consolidate lots 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, and 9 of Block 3, and that's into 4 lots. So it's going to be fairly similar to what we had done before with the Z-lot configuration, only instead of the zigzag lot line, you would have just a straight linear lot line to create rectangular lots. So we go from 30-foot wide lots to 45 feet wide with a reduction of a lot. The applicant would be constructing dwellings similar to the approved plans, and so that's not a request before you tonight on these lots. He'd be having a similar elevation style of house as what's currently been built in Tiempo Commons. It's just for the lots themselves. Also like an ability to construct a single-car house plan. So there's really 2 elements at play here. The consolidation of the lots into larger lots, and then you have the introduction of a single-car house plan. It's proposed to be consistent with the theme and the style of the existing Tiempo development, so we're not deviating from that. All of the original plans that were submitted through the PUD process had 2-car garages, and so as part of our zoning regulations, you're required to have 2 off-street parking spaces per single-family dwelling, so that was in keeping with that when it originally went through the PUD process. So in order to have a single-car garage, you conversely need 20 feet in front of that garage in order to park a car, and so you'd be required to have at least a 20-foot long driveway in front of the garage door in order to have the second parking space. And so it'd be shifting the building back quite a bit more than the existing buildings that are currently developed there, even though you can have the livable space protrude into that 20-foot area, which the applicant's proposing with these models. They're about 15 feet away from that front property line, and then the garage is 20 feet away to accommodate a car. And there's only 4 lots that are deep enough to accommodate this plan. You have the lots on the very north-hand side that are about 70 feet in depth, and the other lots within the development are typically 55 feet in depth. And so you have the ones that we're proposing to consolidate within Block 3. Those are all 30 feet wide by 55 feet deep. And so you'd only be, with the building footprint that you'd be looking at, it'd only be about those 3-4 lots on the north-hand side that would actually accommodate the proposed plan. And this is a survey that was submitted showing the 3 lots being consolidated into 2. So you can see the original lot lines here. So shifting those over so you have 45-foot wide lots instead of 30. And it would just be for that one block. This is the sample elevation that was submitted as part of the single-car design. There is a design that was brought forward in the original PUD that's similar to this design, but it does have tandem configuration in the garage. And so it actually, from the appearance on the outside, looks like it's only a single-car garage, but indeed there are 2-car spaces in there. It's just in a tandem configuration. So this is one of the site plans, or at least the only site plan that was submitted. You have 20 feet. This is the driveway accessing the single-car garage, so you'd have enough space to park a car here. It's come out about 5 feet with a projection for the house in the front. There's a couple sample floor plans.
The presumption was that the property line is on that bottom line right there.
Correct, correct. These were just typical floor plans. You have about 1,400 square feet in size total, so it's within the parameters of what was originally approved as part of the PUD. And then another floor plan which was submitted, and this one has a little bit larger in size, which is 1,500, so still within the 1,100 to 2,100 square foot size that the typical home in Tiempo Commons is. And so I've identified those are the northernmost lots that are a lot deeper than the rest of them, and you already have a similar design. These 2 houses that are already built there, those are, from the outside, they look like they just have a single-car garage, but that's the tandem configuration that I had mentioned. So those have a little bit longer of a driveway. Driveway's about maybe 10 to 12 feet on those units. But the majority of the houses within Tiempo vary in the size of the driveway. There's a longer one here. Some of the rear-loaded ones, maybe there's a 2-3 foot apron off of the street before you get to the garage. There's a couple of those Z lots here. So this is it'd be this house right here. So that's one of the configurations that just had the tandem garage. It'd be similar to the applicant's proposed plan with a gabled roof, horizontal hardy board siding, similar in appearance to what the applicant submitted on this. And that's just another example of a typical house within Tiempo. So when the Commission's reviewing whether or not a request qualifies for a minor PUD amendment, there's these criteria that are laid out by the code. All of them are fairly straightforward. Really the one that's of the most importance is number 5, which is substantially change the bulk or clustering of buildings, visual impact or theme of the development. So that's really the one at play here tonight. The rest of them are fairly straightforward, or either they don't apply, and most of them don't. So I won't go through these, but those were included within your packet. So, and staff has reviewed the proposed amendments and believes they do not substantially alter the bulk or clustering of the buildings or the visual impact of the proposed development. and therefore would be considered to be minor amendments, and are recommending approval of this request tonight. I'd certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mike. Questions for Mike regarding this proposal? Okay. Procedurally, Mike, this isn't a public hearing. We don't need to take testimony.
No, not a public hearing, so it just could be deliberation amongst the commission, or if, I know the applicant.
Go ahead.
Can you then back up to the finding that was sort of I think it was number 5, substantially change the bulk or clustering of the buildings, visual impact, the theme of the development, because I think that I can see several of them that don't apply, that if one was trying to increase the density, and this is decreasing the density.
Sure.
Might be nice to get on the record some of our thoughts relative to the merits of decreasing the density and changing the bulk and spacing of the lots, because that's really what, some of them I see are sliding back a little bit, but are going to be roughly the same.
Yeah.
And some of them are going to have a wider side yard. Is that what's about to happen? Okay. Thoughts, commissioners?
Well, it appears that the garage, maybe I don't know what they looked like before, but the garages have actually gone back a little bit to accommodate the 20 feet relative to the front of the house, which is actually coming
Yeah,
out. That would be good planning according to the Portland Snout House, Halloween rule of garages not being the most prominent thing in the house.
And so
in a way, to me, that's a nice improvement. But
it is, yeah. It's gone away from, like this model, you have the garage, which is the further, the closest to the street. In the applicant's model, it's actually 5 feet back from where the actual projection of the livable space is. So, that is an improvement. And there also are, I didn't mention, but there are lots within this development that are 45 feet, and some of them are greater. And so if you look at this, I know that this lot here is actually already about 47 feet wide, a little bit larger. These lots here on the north are a little bit larger than the typical, and so when you're thinking about the consolidation of these lots into 2 instead of 3, you do have a variation in lot sizes. These are fairly uniform here, except for the Z lots, which are essentially the same thing as what the applicant's proposing, only in a single-story configuration. And a straight, linear line splitting the two instead of the zigzag line. But you do have a variation of lot sizes and widths to the street. These are all over 30 feet and range from probably 35 to 45 feet in width. So.
Okay. So yeah, there seems to be a texture of widths. It's not
not
uniform thing.
Correct.
Right. And so this is shifting that texture, but not out of keeping with the texture.
Correct.
Yeah, I don't think, as the project was proposed back in 2007, you take a shot at what's going to sell and what isn't, and struggle with that issue. And I don't see these proposals that we've seen, these small changes, haven't changed the texture of the development. And I think it's hard to imagine that everyone can predict exactly what's going to sell in the next 8 or 10 years as you do a project. So it looks just fine to me. I don't see anything to quibble about. It just seems that the entire, I don't know, I don't drive by every day, but I did just a few days ago, but the sense of the place doesn't change much from what these small changes are, whether it's 35 feet or 40 here, because they are mixed. So I think
they're all small lot developments, and that's a nice option.
So I think it's, I'm happy.
Mike, was there any other finding in particular that you would like us to, we looked at number 5 for a minute.
We could scan over them.
I just want to, so that you have in the record the sort of things you would need.
Yeah, we're not increasing the enclosed square footage of any category of primary use more than 5%, or increasing the dwelling unit count of the approved PUD by more than 1% of the final PUD approved plan. Not altering the ratio of number of dwelling units of different housing types, so it's all of one homogeneous housing type here. Does not increase the floor area of a use not permitted in the underlying zoning district. It's R4, so it would allow multifamily. These are single-family dwellings, so no issue there. Exceed the residential density of the original PUD approval. We're actually reducing density by a little bit, so no issue there either. Doesn't substantially change the location of uses or the layout of lots, streets, trails, pathways, except for minor adjustments within the areas approved for development or within anticipated right-of-ways. So not affecting any of those things. Doesn't substantially change the environmental impact of the development or alter the phasing or timing of the development. Doesn't reduce or eliminate factors used to justify any density bonus or code standard waivers. So reducing density here, so none of those bonuses are affected. Doesn't substantially alter conditions of approval placed upon the original PUD or create conditions which, based upon the record, might warrant new or additional conditions of approval. It doesn't negate justification of any of the relevant criteria and standards in the reason statement supporting the original PUD approval. So
what would you like the amendment or the motion to look like, Mike? Is this just a is it a recommendation to council, or is it just is it an action?
This is for minor amendments. You would be the final hearing body, so you would just be approving the minor amendment request.
So the motion would be to approve the minor amendment request.
Correct.
Okay. Is there anybody who would like to make that motion?
Yeah, I'd make that motion that we approve the minor PUD amendment as proposed by staff.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion before we vote? All in favor of the motion to approve the PUD amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? You have it. You're welcome to stay. We have fun things to do, or you can step on out.
Yep. Thanks for listening to our educational night. We appreciate having some, sharing some information with our Moscow folks. Sometimes no one comes.
Yeah, we had a big crowd tonight. All right, Mike.
There's a whole world out there, no?
Moving on, Legacy Crossing Design Guidelines Window Opening Requirement Review.
So just pick it up where we left off last time. If you recall, we had talked about the off-street parking requirement within urban mixed commercial and Legacy Crossing overlay, and the disparity there, or the conflict between the two codes. And we also, through the review process of the recent proposals that went to the Urban Renewal Agency, had identified that maybe there may be a slight issue with the window opening requirement within the design guidelines, just maybe worthy to take a look at. And it just struck us as, in looking at the elevations that were presented, how low the percentages ended up being of window coverage within those elevations. So just wanted to go over. I've got a few more examples this time to discuss. And I think it's also important to think about maybe the recent market study that I went over at the beginning of the meeting with potentially more residential and medical office type uses that may be introduced within Legacy Crossing, and accounting for maybe a reduced percentage in window openings for those uses that may want a little bit more privacy on the street than your typical retail use that you want to be able to see in and have customers see out onto the street for safety within those uses. And so we've gone over the general design guidelines for the facade, and just, within the design guidelines talks about shouldn't have the main entrance in the building, a number of transparent window openings, blank walls should be discouraged. All facades, a clear visual distinction between each floor should be provided. It's all these facade elements that should be incorporated within each facade elevation. They should have solid surfaces and window openings to avoid the creation of blank walls and or glass curtain walls. Window openings should be balanced to avoid large blank wall surfaces on the facade. And then the rear and side facades should also be designed similar to the facades that front streets or pedestrian ways, but they are allowed to be a little bit less or a little more simpler than the main facades. Then we get to the section on window openings, and so this was the aspect that we were looking at before. And so it says 50% to 85% of ground floor facades that front public streets and pedestrian ways should be occupied by windows and or entry doors. And then it provides visual illustration here that how the massing should be broken up on these building facades. Talks about how it should utilize clear, transparent glass in order to provide clear views of storefront displays from the street and allow natural surveillance, kind of all those things we had talked about before. So bringing back the sangria selection here, I originally said 51% for the window openings on this, but that was accounting for the other facade, which would be on the northeast corner as well as the east corner. There are a couple blank walls there, and so that's why that was so low. Looking back on this is just the north side. You can see this is 54%, and so the red outlined is the area. You also have this blank wall there, which is driving that down a little bit. If you were to look at just moving maybe including another window in that blank wall, or just moving that area over to look at that, you're looking at about what Wendy had said before, with 59% of the wall being either doors or window openings. And so you're around 60%, 10% more than what the threshold is within the design guidelines. So just wanted to take a look at what that would mean. Obviously, we talked about last time, I think Nels brought up that it's going to be quite a big difference if you reduce the windows here above the awning, or if you brought them in on the sides. It's going to have quite a different feel on the street and the pedestrian scale, whether you do those two things. And looking at increasing or decreasing the width of the openings for the windows, you're looking at 50% there, and so it brings it in maybe 6 inches to a foot on either side to bring it down to 50%. We were discussing maybe bringing it down to 40% for these commercial retail uses, but this is what 40% would look like. So quite a bit of a drastic change when you're thinking about the amount of wall area that you'd have to window area. And so this would all be wall area, and then you'd be reduced to the window area of these. It would look not as drastic, but similar to the old Daily News building on Jackson, where it had those long, skinny windows, vertical windows. But if you look at the pedestrian scale, if you were to do a square windows instead of this long vertical, granted they'd still be 40%. If you were to reduce it here so there was no window above, this is the awning, metal awning that goes across here. If you were to reduce it in this area, you would still have the same window opening down here, which is just a little bit of perspective, and you'd still be at that 40%. So I think a large part of this lies on the shape of the window and how it relates to the pedestrian scale of people walking down the street. This is the 1912 Center. So looked at that bottom courtyard area on the south side of the building, and this one came out at 50%. I did include these areas over here, and that's why it did bring it down a little bit. Not including those areas, you're at about 52% there. So just to give you a little bit of perspective on other buildings, what their percentages are. A little bit hard to see here, but this is University Point building. So this is our have our one building within Legacy Crossing, which is of newer development. This one comes in at 52%. So still meeting the threshold of 50%, but just barely. So really just wanted some direction at this point. We talked about maybe reducing the commercial uses, maybe retail uses to less than 40. I don't know if that maybe is a good thing at this point when looking at, when you go down to 40%, how narrow those windows could become. You know, that's still up for discussion. I think that we want to provide some flexibility at the Commission because all of these proposals are going to be coming to the Commission during the design review process. And so you're going to be reviewing the proposals against what the design guidelines are and then rendering a recommendation of approval with conditions or denial of a development request within Legacy Crossing. So what staff is proposing now is to leave 50 to 85% of ground floor facades, but incorporate of retail uses that front public streets and pedestrian ways should be occupied by windows and or entry doors. And then add a second paragraph to that to say that ground floor facades of all other uses that front public streets and pedestrian ways may have less than 50% window and or entry door area when not located along primary activity centers in the Legacy Crossing overlay area. And so, you know, when I was crafting that in my mind, I don't know if you want to put a lesser threshold on, you know, may not be less than 30% there, just to give yourself some direction when you're reviewing these. But really the intention is just to give some flexibility. If you had a residential development that had residential on the ground floor, it was just a strictly residential building, or if you had some type of medical office use where there needs to be some type of privacy between the street level offices, rooms, and the street. And so I think it's worthy of including that within the design guidelines. Whether or not that's the right language, I'm relying on you to provide some direction there.
Okay. Mike, remind me, it currently is specifying that the glass be clear glass.
Correct.
I'm thinking the medical office, a different way to wiggle would be to say that you could have obscured glass over portions of the window, if we were to talk about obscured glass being permitted for some classes of use.
Sure.
Okay, yeah. So we'd have to...
Yeah, it says discouraged glass should be discouraged.
Okay.
Or transparent glass, correct.
Right. Okay.
Well, there's other architectural considerations, like you don't want a lot of glazing on the west side because it's very hard to mitigate. And that would be one, but then balancing that out on the other end with you don't want a lot of blank walls if you're going to have safe streets and a safe neighborhood. So we have that visual connection. So I'm a little uncomfortable with going with nothing on that second piece. I think we need to figure out what that bottom should be, bottom percentage should be threshold. I don't know if it's 25%. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
When you say going with nothing, meaning this
second
may
part.
be less, but there's no floor.
There's no floor, and we need a floor. Okay. I think, I think it would be a mistake not to have one.
Okay.
So.
Other thoughts?
Other uses being retail or non-commercial uses.
It would allow some commercial uses, but it mainly just be primarily retail in the beginning. And then so there are a number of uses in urban mixed commercial zone, residential by conditional use permit, you have light manufacturing, you have medical offices, you have other types of offices. So I think that, instead of just listing all the individual uses on there, I think that keeping it open like that would allow Planning and Zoning Commission to make a decision at a case-by-case basis about the type of use, and maybe the developers saying that they have special needs, that they need a reduction in window size, and to be able to review that at the time and make a decision.
Joel?
Well, I would also like to see some sort of a minimum in the second bullet there. 30% maybe.
Okay. Rob?
Well, and I agree, and there was some discussion earlier about the possibility that maybe there would be residential on the first floor for mixed use, which I think could be good, but I guess the question is, what would you typically see for a residence? Was it 25% or 30%? And I don't know the answer to the question, but it might be a good idea for us to find out what something like that would look, so that we could have a reasonable judgment of what that floor should be. I don't know.
A lot of these facades that are models in here are historic, or at least strongly referential to historic. I wonder if we could look at some brownstone or other sort of more residential historic pattern and get an idea of how those succeed. And maybe it's another element, and it's not the glazing, but it's the stoop that comes out, or that makes the kind of character, that's the trade-off. You want less glass, but you trade for more articulation or something. So that might be a way, I don't know, if you're attracted to that thought of asking staff to think about looking at some of that to help us come up with this 30% or other argument.
Well, if you're looking at attached housing, multi-story, it's, if there's any kind of, you have to access daylight for bedrooms and egress and everything else, so I don't think it's going to be possible to squeeze down on residential lighting a whole lot and be able to meet code requirements for exiting and daylight access to all living spaces, et cetera. So that's going to solve that problem by, anyway. So.
One of the Nels, I think.
I was thinking the same thing in terms of egress windows, but also I like the idea of thinking about the lack of energy efficiency with glazing. Right. There's just only so much that anyone's been able to do to improve that at this point. So.
Nels.
Well, I was just thinking about if there's residential, there's more and more doors as well as small windows, and so walking by it isn't. I think the thing that we are worried about is more light industrial or some kind of use. You put we see an example of a convention center or something that just has a block of nothing.
An air intake.
And so that's a little tricky to try and just give that a best piece of advice. One of the great ones is in Boise, where they built the Grove Hotel. You walk for a whole block along this big concrete wall. It's just the ugliest thing that they could have possibly imagined. And so it's nothing to walk by, and I'm not just sure, but I can't get my hands around how what we want to say here. You almost need some kind of language that talks about the kind of streetscape that we want, but without discouraging people who have a big idea that want to come into Legacy Crossing that might not fit what we've imagined.
And most buildings need a dumpster side, mechanical systems and maybe less transparent side for that type of infrastructure. So.
Well, these are just for the facades the main facades that front public streets.
And, as Hello Walk is developed, I don't know, we're going to go back and reinvent the wheel, but along that may, I don't know if that's considered, are we considering it a public street?
Oh, Hello Walk, you mean?
For Hello Walk.
Would be a pedestrian way, certainly.
Pedestrian way,
So, yeah.
exactly. And there we want
Sure.
this sort of thing.
No,
So
you want eyes on the
there
street
are-
on that to make it safe to walk through there, you know, and so.
On the other hand, if it's out on, I mean, you think about a street like Jackson that has big, fast traffic going on it, it's just no fun to walk along there at all, is it? Though ESMI or whoever they are continue to have windows, and it certainly is, it's a good thing.
Sure.
You know, we've liked that.
Yeah.
I think there's another thing that's striking me is that the hotel example or the convention center, they are very large, single ownership, single activity. And what I'm thinking that a lot of what we like in these examples are, and we've read some articles about the smaller scale downtown building, which just naturally gets more rhythm because there's more variation between buildings rather than monolithic architecture. But again, I'm not sure how to capture that in
It's tricky.
language.
It's tricky because, you know, what if you came in, some days I thought that it would have been great, I know they're not going to go there now, but would have, what if we had the ice skating rink had decided they could be in Legacy Crossing? It would be really easy to make an ice skating rink that didn't have a bunch of windows in it. On the other hand, the ice skating rink in McCall that's so successful is just glass, and as you drive by or walk by, you see people skating. And so I'm convinced we want to continue with this, but I'm feeling good with the 50 now that you've looked things for us, but I don't know if you'd think I'd be so smart to be able to exactly know what we want to say about it. But what I don't want to do is get in the way of good development that might come along that might surprise us.
Yeah. So I think I'm hearing you say, Wendy used the word a floor in the second bullet point. I'm not sure we know what that floor is, but that's an activity.
Yeah.
But I also want to back up to your thought, which was maybe there are reasons to want less glazing, and Wendy's about less facades. That is there a third bullet point to mull over, which is variation from these standards can be allowed in cases where environmental impacts are more significant. I mean, it's hard to, again, not make it so slippery that we can't work with it.
I personally think not, but, you know, I just walked by today, the education building is going to is being redesigned. Miller Hull, they brought in a Seattle architect, but for years that has been a dense building. The education building has been a building that seemed vaguely frightening, and it's now going to have glass on these floors, and I was just walking by and thinking, wow, this is going to be so much fun to be able to walk in front of the education building and know that there's actually people in there doing things. So I certainly don't, and I would rather be lifelike than to save. I don't know about the I don't want to say I'm not for saving energy.
I know
I
you
am.
would go there.
But we have better glass now and better ways to shade things. And so it's really critical, I think, to have for the liveliness. I mean, we've been walking for 30 years in front of the education building, and I couldn't believe how attractive that drawing was that said, we're going to take off these concrete panels and you're going to be able to see educators in there learning stuff, which I thought was good.
A comment by one of the members of the audience.
Thank you, John. Would you come up to the microphone, state your name, address for the record, please?
Hello, my name is Jeff DeMerler. I live at 1686 Christopher Lane. I just had a little bit of discussion on this point. Maybe it's better to look at it from the standpoint of not the windows and the percentages of the windows, but the percentage of wall. No more than 20% blank wall. The rest can be a door, a window, anything else but a wall. Then it can be easily developed, changed, modified, because a door isn't ugly. A door is an inviting thing as well as a window.
Yeah, it is.
It wouldn't look like the education building then if you said no more than 20% can be a blank wall or whatever that ground, whatever that would be. So.
Okay. And so following that idea, Mike, could you back up to the 1912 Center and the slides?
Thanks, Jeff.
Yes, thank you for that thought.
Yeah.
Because what I like in that building is also the entryways that flank the courtyard, which have a lot less glazing, but have a lot of non-blank wallness, right? They're three-dimensional, they've got lots of texture, and then there's just a door with some glazing in it. So it's the big blank panel that becomes the oppressive experience for the pedestrian, that all I'm doing is walking past a solid wall and it goes way up.
Yeah, the texture of this place is, of course, well, I've come to love this building, so I think it's beautiful. But that being said, it has that texture, and what we're not. So Jeff's thought about just not having less than some percent of plain wall. People need to think about something besides just a plain concrete wall.
So that may give us a different way to write the floor. No more than 20% blank wall, and that gives them the commission to say, oh, wow, we can argue a little bit. Is that a blank wall, or is that rich fenestration around a doorway that is not glazed?
Yeah, we also have all those sections that talk about fenestration and requiring certain things, projecting facade elements, and then other portions that I didn't include within the design guidelines that require you to pick certain things in order to break up those facades, and so they're not just blank walls. You have clear distinction, crown molding at the, cornice molding at the very top. You have breakup between the floors and some type of treatment. There's a whole list, and I can certainly go through those next time. If
I think we even have some language in the large.
The LRE guidelines.
I mean, if you recall, a few years ago, out at the mall, there were just a couple of doors and a bunch of big walls, and the people who have businesses have seen that was really crummy, and without much guidance, we now have lots of doors and windows going into the thing in the mall, even though it is never going to be really beautiful, is at least a lot more attractive. The walking in front of the mall is now, and you can go in here and go in there and go in somewhere else, and that's what you're looking for. When we talked about safety, one of those other things that it's all about is on a dark night and you're walking down this big wall, it's not a safe feeling. The mall's getting better and better so that you don't mind walking in front of it, and most of the corporations or restaurants who want to be there have seen that. It was just took a while to get there.
So, Mike, do you feel you have some more direction at least?
Yeah.
Have we been helpful yet? We'll stay till we're talking about.
So next time, I mean, I could bring back other examples of maybe residential on the ground floor. I think it may help with a couple of readings we've selected. Those provide some pretty good examples of residential on the ground floor. Usually it's discussing stoops, like Nils had mentioned, but also it looks like they do have a little bit smaller size windows, but they're elevated. Instead of just right there, three feet off the ground, instead you have the privacy. You still have a lot of the sunlight, but you have a little more privacy than you do with just a window that's 3 feet off the ground and straight up. And so those are kind of the ideas that they've done to account for the privacy with those.
One of the things that we might see, I hope, is a residential building that has parking underneath it and then stick-built 3 or 4 stories above, which we see in Portland and Seattle and Boise all the time now. But if you have parking on the bottom, then it gets a little more complicated, because how do you make that interesting? How do you make walking in front? And Boise solved it with the parking. I'm just thinking that if Legacy Crossing's ever really successful, we're going to have parking there. We're going to have to figure out how to make that work. And one of the things that Boise tried to do was put little shops on the edge of the street, and then parking went in a doorway and parked in behind it. And so it gets really complicated to just try and have a simple rule that says what it has to be.
Sure. Deb, I think you had a thought.
Well, I just wondered if the residential were with a stoop, do we get into a problem of handicap accessibility in any way with any other regulations?
There are a number of those units that may be required to be accessible, but there are a number of them that could be adaptable. So
Okay.
that
So
not all the ground
thing.
floor units would be required to be.
Okay. All right. Any more input for Mike? Okay, thank you. And the next item is our review of fiscal year 16 commission budget request.
Another discussion that we have.
Well, I believe the last few years we've requested $1,500 and received that every year. And so I've gone back through and looked at what we've actually spent that money for. So FY14, we ended up only spending around $400, and it was mainly for a gift for art. We had some USPS postage, and that was for the mailing of our survey. We had in there Survey Monkey subscription, so any of these large projects where we need to set up a Survey Monkey account or send surveys out to the public, we incur these expenses. There's also a couple nameplates for new P&Z members that year. This year, we've got about $200 tied up. We received another $1,500 this year. We have, same thing, survey postage, I think, from the October survey. We've got a gift card for Jim Boland when he left the commission for the council, and we also have a nameplate for Rob. So,
What if we had, we have these shared readings, but what if we had some sort of continuing ed opportunity where either we have access to a broadcast, something we have to pay into, especially as we're dealing with Legacy Crossing and and climate change issues. If after looking at that survey, I'm realizing there's a lot more momentum in this community than I thought there was, for us to maybe think about that a little more. What if we use some funds or something like that? And I don't know if that means securing a video or something. That's just an idea. But.
So, I like that compared to professional learning where we send somebody away. You can spend a lot of money
all
on
of it
travel.
coming to us, yeah.
And in a venue that might be appreciated by other members of the public or other members of staff or something. Other thoughts about?
I like the lighting.
Okay.
Nelson,
John.
were I you, I would suggest, I would ask for the 1,500. And you don't use it, but you can still get it. It's not like we're going to say, you didn't use it last year, so we're not going to give it to you this year. But couch it in such a way that if something comes along, like Wendy just suggested, you're able to spend the money without having to come back to the council and have the budget reopened. And it'll give you the freedom to do the things that were talked about here, plus the freedom to do something else if it comes along that you feel will be helpful to the effort.
Okay.
So I would agree. I wouldn't go back to those, even though we've spent less money. I think we could be more proactive about the education of ourselves and or send our chair to something that was important. So let's just stay with that status that we have.
I think I heard a motion that said for requested budget of 1,500.
I would recommend. Do you have a figure?
It's 1,500, but I was just going to say, I can read the paragraph, how we intend to use the money.
Go ahead.
And it's for commission professional development funding. This is proposed to be used to fund costs for attendance to local planning, training opportunities, subscriptions to professional publications and journals, guest speakers, and other professional development and training activities. So that you feel like that encompasses everything that... Okay.
So move.
Second. Here we go. Any further discussion?
I do have one question. The unexpended balance goes where at the end of the year?
Goes right back into the general fund.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so with that, all in favor of requesting the same budget for the same purposes, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. All right. Anything else for the good of the order? We are adjourned. Thank you.